A few years back, I had the good fortune to attend a convention hosted by Voice of the Martyrs. And Voice of the Martyrs is an organization that supports and helps Christians who are persecuted throughout the world. At that particular conference, there was a woman present telling her story about being a pastor's wife in Iran. As she told the story, she said that her husband had been arrested by the authorities and dragged off to prison. He'd been gone for about 3 months, and she could only imagine his suffering. She could imagine his terrible conditions that he was held in. She could imagine the torture that he was undergoing. And she prayed to God. She said, "Lord, I'm not as strong as he is. Please keep me safe. Because if they torture me, I'll tell them everything. If they torture me, I won't be able to stand up to it." And some days after she prayed that prayer, a knock came at her door in the middle of the night. She was arrested, and she herself was taken to prison. The first night in prison, she was brought into an interrogation room, and there she was confronted by an Islamic official, a government interrogator. He sat her down at the table, and he said to her, "Why do you tell people about this Jesus? Don't you know it's against the law?" She told the story. She said, "I don't know where these words came from. But I told them, I tell people about Jesus because they need to hear about Jesus. Because only in Jesus is their salvation. Because in Jesus they can find happiness and peace and meaning to their life. And people I tell about Jesus need to hear about Jesus. You need to hear about Jesus," she said to him. She said, "Look at how unhappy you are. Look at how miserable you are. Look at how sad you are. Look at how angry you are. You need Jesus in your life." He said, "For saying these things, your punishment will be twice as difficult." Back she went to her cell. And the cell was small and dirty and dingy, and she was a fairly well-to-do person in her earlier life, and she wasn't used to conditions like this. She hated it. And she prayed to God. She said, "God, this is all on you. I asked you to help me, and here I am." So the next day, same thing, middle of the night, dragged down to the interrogation room, sat down at the table across from the bushy-bearded Islamic interrogator, who said the exact same things. "You must not tell people about Jesus." She said to him, "I have to tell people about Jesus because that's who I am. I have to tell people about Jesus because they need to hear about Jesus." Back to her cell. The third night she was there, same thing. Dragged down to the interrogation room, plunked down at the table, confronted by the Islamic interrogator. And again he told her she must not talk about Jesus, and again she told him she had no choice. She must tell people about Jesus. Back to her cell. About 10 minutes later, he showed up in the cell. He walked in the cell and approached her. And she thought to herself, "Here it comes. This is what I feared. He's going to torture me. He may rape me. I could be killed. And I don't have the strength to go through this." In the gospel today, Jesus helps us to understand people like that interrogator. Because it's easy to look at the interrogator and say, that man should not be able to live. How can we get rid of him? How can we take him out of the picture? So Jesus tells a story about a farmer who sows his wheat crop. And he sows great wheat, beautiful seeds. Except that in the night an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat to sabotage a competitor and another farmer. When the wheat crop began to sprout, and when the sower's servants saw the problem, they went to him and they said, let's just pull up the weeds. Let's get them now. And that's a solution. But the farmer had a better solution. He says, wait a second. At this early stage of the plant's development, it's hard to tell what's wheat and what's weed. Because the weed in question looks a whole lot like a wheat plant, especially in its early life. And by the time it gets big enough so that you can easily distinguish between the weed and the wheat, it's too late because their roots have become intermeshed. And there's no way to separate them out. So he said, wait and be patient. Harvest time is coming. We can separate everything out then. I think what Jesus is trying to tell us is that there will always be a problem of good and evil growing up around us in our world. We see it today, I think. You see a lot of people who I think we can fairly judge to be evil, to be bad actors. We see violence in our streets. We see insensitivity among people for each other's concerns and cares. We see a lot of hostility and anger filling our world, our nation, our community, even our churches. And it's very easy to say, let's get rid of the bad guys. Why can't we take our political enemies and execute them? That was a solution that Marxists used, and communists, and fascists, and Nazis. They had enemies. What did they do? They liquidated them. Let's get rid of our foes. Now, how else can we liquidate our enemies? Well, we can cancel them out. We can treat them like non-entities. We can tear them down because of things they can't control or that they can't change. We can mock them and deride them and demean them because of their race, their sex, their sexual orientation. All of those things have been used and are being used to vilify others. If you don't embrace the Black Lives Matter movement completely, why, you must be a white supremacist. But if you do find meaning and hope in the notion that black lives do matter, well, you could be an extremist and a very dangerous anarchist. So let's get rid of each other, right? Let's cancel each other out. No, that's not God's solution. And it can't be ours either as Christians. Or look at the church. The church is full of its dogmas, right, and its doctrines. We know full well who's good and who's bad, who's righteous, who's a sinner. Let's get rid of those sinners. Let's excommunicate them. Well, gay people in the church? Well, that has to be against Scripture, right? So let's ban them. Is that what God wants? You think that really? Snoopy in the Peanuts cartoons was writing in one cartoon was writing a book. Charlie Brown came along and said, "Snoopy, I heard you're writing a theology book." Snoopy said, "Yes, I am." Charlie said, "What's the title?" Snoopy said, the title is, Have You Ever Thought You Might Be Wrong? Have you ever thought you might be wrong? In Jesus' day, the scribes, the Pharisees, the chief priests, the temple leadership, they weren't bad guys, they were good guys. They tried really hard to live according to the law of Moses. They just got so stuck on their own righteousness that they couldn't recognize that God doesn't always do what they tell him to. And God doesn't always do what we tell him to either. So I think what the parable tells us is hold your horses. God says the solution is humility and patience. Humility is the realization that we might be wrong. And the other guy might be right. And even if he's not completely right, he may have something to teach us. Listen. Try to understand. Try to accept. Try to act lovingly, because that's what the gospel asks of us. It asks us to love each other. And it tells us to do that as Jesus loved, with no strings attached. Is there evil? Is there good? Absolutely there is. But the parable says God takes care of that. It's not within the scope of our competence to judge others. Jesus says elsewhere in the Gospels, judge not. And he means it. We shouldn't judge. And if we must judge, we must judge kindly. Because that is the measure that we, I think, would like to be measured by as well. Give the other person a break. Give them the benefit of every doubt you can think of. Allow them to make mistakes, because we all do that. And while we're being patient and humble about the world around us, I think God asks us to be patient and humble with ourselves. Solzhenitsyn writes that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. There are weeds and there is wheat growing within us. And God isn't uprooting. God is patiently letting us develop. Because it is only over time that we can allow the wheat to grow while the weeds die. It's only over time that God can manage us and manage our world so that his will is done on earth. And it will be. What he asks of us is to be kind to each other. What he asks of us is not to judge each other. And what he asks us to do is to give him the benefit of the doubt as well, because he may be developing in us through our faults and developing in others through theirs something beautiful and good for his kingdom. Sometimes we need to be broken so that we understand how important it is to be fixed. The guard approached our Christian woman in her cell, and she was terrified. At that moment, as he approached, she sure did wish that God would strike him down, but that's not what happened. As he got close to her, as he could sense her terror, he said to her, "Don't be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. "You are an angel." He said, "How did you know how unhappy I have been? How did you know that I had been seeking peace in my religion and I have not found it? How did you know about my sadness?" He said, "You are right. I need Jesus. Will you teach me about him?" They talked in her cell for 2 hours. In that 2-hour period, he said that he would teach her and her husband safer ways to evangelize in Iran. He managed to get both of them released from prison, and all he asked of them was that they would teach him how to be a disciple of Christ. See, the ones that look most like weeds can turn into beautiful wheat. And I think that's what God asks us to realize in this parable, that we are surrounded by people who he has made, and he has not made one human being in vain. All are good. Fundamentally, they bear his image. Some go astray. There is certainly evil. But we need to believe that God is busy drawing all things to his Christ. May that Christ that saved a woman in Iran fill our hearts with love and peace, patience and humility.